On a spring morning in 1944, Lieutenant Joe Moser climbed into his P-38 Lightning at an airbase in southern England. The mission briefing had been routine: escort heavy bombers deep into Germany, protect them from enemy fighters, return to base. Moser had flown these missions before. The P-38's twin engines and long range made it ideal for bomber escort before the P-51 Mustang arrived in large numbers. The mission proceeded as planned until the return flight. Moser noticed a B-17 Flying Fortress struggling to maintain altitude. 2 engines were shot out. The bomber was falling behind the formation, descending slowly toward the English Channel. Without escort, the crippled bomber would be easy prey for German fighters. The crew would likely die. Moser made a decision. He broke formation and descended to escort the damaged bomber. He flew circles around the B-17, watching for threats, burning fuel with every maneuver. The bomber crew threw everything out the hatches: ammunition, machine guns, heavy clothing, anything not essential. They were trying to maintain altitude long enough to reach England. Both aircraft crossed the Channel. As they neared London, the B-17 veered toward its base. Moser continued toward his own airfield at Warmwell. His fuel gauges read empty. He was flying on fumes, on whatever fuel remained in the lines after the tanks ran dry. When he touched down, Moser estimated he had ounces of fuel left. Not gallons, ounces. This story illustrates what every long-range fighter pilot in World War II understood. Fuel management was not a technical exercise. It was life and death. Running out of fuel over enemy territory meant capture or death. Running out of fuel over the ocean meant ditching in water and hoping for rescue. Running out of fuel anywhere meant you were done flying. Pilots calculated fuel consumption obsessively. They monitored gauges constantly. They made decisions that balanced mission requirements against fuel reserves. The mathematics were unforgiving. A P-38 Lightning carried roughly 410 gallons of internal fuel in standard configuration. The 2 Allison V-1710 engines burned fuel at rates that varied with power settings, altitude, and flight conditions. At cruise power, fuel consumption might be 75 to 80 gallons per hour total for both engines. At combat power, consumption could exceed 150 gallons per hour. At maximum power, the aircraft might burn through its entire fuel load in less than 3 hours. External drop tanks extended range dramatically. A P-38 carrying 2 165-gallon drop tanks had 740 gallons total capacity. This allowed missions lasting 8 to 9 hours under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions rarely existed in combat. Climbing to altitude burned extra fuel. Evasive maneuvers burned extra fuel. Combat burned enormous amounts of fuel. Every minute at full power consumed fuel that might be needed for the flight home. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how fuel limitations shaped fighter operations in World War II. How pilots learned to calculate range and endurance with lives depending on accuracy. How external tanks transformed fighter capabilities but created new tactical problems. How decisions made in briefing rooms determined whether pilots would have enough fuel to complete missions. How some missions pushed aircraft to absolute limits of endurance. And how the fighters that could fly farthest helped win the war by escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. The problem of fighter range had constrained military aviation since fighters first appeared in World War I. Fighters were small aircraft optimized for speed and maneuverability. Small size meant limited fuel capacity. Limited fuel meant limited range. Limited range meant fighters could only operate near their bases. Bombers, which were larger and carried more fuel, could strike targets that fighters could not reach. This created a fundamental tactical problem. Bombers without fighter escort were vulnerable to enemy fighters. But fighters lacked range to escort bombers on long missions. This problem became acute in the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. American doctrine emphasized daylight precision bombing. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators would strike German industrial targets in daylight, hitting with greater accuracy than night bombing allowed. The bombers carried heavy defensive armament. Formation flying concentrated firepower. American planners believed bombers could defend themselves without fighter escort. German fighters proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s attacked bomber formations with tactics specifically designed to defeat defensive gun positions. German pilots attacked from ahead where bomber defensive fire was weakest. They attacked in groups, concentrating fire on individual bombers. They used cannon that outranged bomber machine guns. American bomber losses mounted steadily through 1942 and 1943. The crisis came at Schweinfurt in October 1943. The target was ball-bearing plants deep in Germany. 291 B-17s launched the mission. 60 were shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. The 8th Air Force lost more than 25% of the attacking force in a single mission. No air force could sustain such losses. Deep penetration missions were suspended. The bombing campaign faced potential collapse. The solution was fighter escort. But in October 1943, no American fighter had sufficient range to escort bombers all the way to Schweinfurt and back. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which equipped most 8th Air Force fighter groups, had combat radius of roughly 200 miles with internal fuel. Even with external tanks, P-47s could not reach targets deep in Germany. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had longer range but suffered serious problems in the cold high-altitude environment over Europe. The North American P-51 Mustang was just entering service. Understanding combat radius versus range requires understanding how fuel consumption works. An aircraft's maximum range is the distance it can fly under ideal conditions with all fuel consumed. Combat radius is different. Combat radius assumes the aircraft must fly to the target, engage in combat that burns fuel at high rates, and return to base with fuel reserves for emergencies. Combat radius is typically 1/3 to 1/4 of maximum range. A P-38 with internal fuel and two 165-gallon drop tanks had maximum range approaching 2,300 miles under ferry conditions. Ferry conditions meant no combat, optimal cruising speed, minimal maneuvering. Combat radius was 700 to 800 miles. The difference represented fuel burned climbing to altitude, fuel burned in combat, fuel burned during evasive maneuvers, and fuel reserves for landing. The external drop tanks themselves created tactical complications. Drop tanks increased drag, reducing speed and maneuverability. If enemy fighters attacked, pilots had to jettison drop tanks immediately to fight effectively. Once tanks were jettisoned, range reverted to internal fuel only. This created difficult decisions. If you drop tanks too early, you might not have fuel to reach the target or return home. If you held tanks too long, you fought at a disadvantage and risked being shot down. Pilots developed techniques for managing this trade-off. Standard procedure was to fly on external fuel first, preserving internal fuel for combat and return flight. When combat began, pilots jettisoned external tanks and fought on internal fuel. This maximized range while ensuring maximum performance when fighting. But it required careful fuel management. Pilots had to know precisely how much fuel they had consumed, how much remained, and whether they could reach home. Fuel gauges provided approximate readings but were not precise. Different aircraft of the same type often had slightly different fuel consumption characteristics. Engine condition affected consumption. Altitude affected consumption. Temperature affected consumption. Pilots learned their own aircraft through experience. They knew how much fuel-specific power settings consumed. They calculated remaining endurance constantly. Mission planning incorporated fuel calculations at every stage. Intelligence officers identified targets. Operations officers planned routes. Weather officers forecast winds at various altitudes. Engineering officers calculated fuel requirements. The calculations determined how many aircraft could reach the target, whether escorts could accompany bombers all the way, and what alternatives existed if conditions changed. A typical mission planning session for a long-range escort mission might work as follows. Target: synthetic oil plant at Luna, Germany. Distance from base: 550 miles one way, 1,100 miles round trip. Bomber cruise speed, 160 miles per hour. Fighter cruise speed must match bomber speed to provide escort. Time to target, approximately 3.5 hours. Time at target and return, approximately 7 hours total flight time. P-38 fuel consumption at cruise power matching bomber speed, approximately 75 gallons per hour. 7 hours flight time requires 525 gallons minimum. P-38 internal fuel, 410 gallons. Required external fuel, at least 115 gallons. Standard external tanks, 2 165-gallon tanks. Total fuel, 740 gallons. Fuel available for combat and reserves, 215 gallons. Combat time at high power, approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Reserve for landing, 30 minutes at cruise power equals approximately 40 gallons. These calculations determined what missions were possible. If targets exceeded fighter range even with external tanks, bombers went unescorted or missions were scrubbed. If weather forecasts showed headwinds that increased fuel consumption, missions might be canceled. If external tanks were unavailable, long-range missions could not be flown. Fuel availability was as important as aircraft availability. The logistics of fuel supply were staggering. American forces in Europe consumed millions of gallons of aviation gasoline monthly. Tankers shipped fuel across the Atlantic. Pipelines distributed fuel from ports to airfields. Trucks delivered fuel to dispersal points. Ground crews refueled aircraft between missions. The entire logistics chain existed to ensure fighters and bombers had fuel when needed. The fuel itself was sophisticated. Aviation gasoline in World War II used octane ratings far higher than automotive fuel. Higher octane allowed higher compression ratios and higher power output. Early war American aircraft used 87-octane fuel. By mid-war, 100-octane was standard. Late-war aircraft used 100-130 or 100-150 grade fuel. The numbers indicated anti-knock performance at lean mixture and rich mixture conditions. Higher octane fuel allowed engines to produce more power without detonation that could destroy engines. A P-38 engine rated at 1,425 horsepower on 100-octane fuel might produce 1,475 horsepower on 100-130 fuel. The extra power translated to higher speed, better climb rate, and improved combat performance. But higher-grade fuel was more expensive and required more complex refining. Availability was always limited. Pilots learned to husband fuel through techniques that seemed small but accumulated into meaningful savings. Proper leaning of fuel mixture reduced consumption. Cruising at optimal altitude where engines operated most efficiently reduced consumption. Flying smoothly without unnecessary maneuvering reduced consumption. Using autopilot on long overwater flights reduced consumption because autopilot flew more precisely than human pilots maintaining heading manually. The psychological pressure was constant. Every fighter pilot on a long-range mission knew that fuel was life. Watching fuel gauges descend created stress that compounded normal combat stress. Pilots developed habits to manage this stress. Some calculated fuel remaining every 15 minutes. Others calculated estimated endurance to determine how long they could remain at cruise power before needing to consider alternatives. All pilots knew the point of no return, the moment when they lacked fuel to reach home and had to consider emergency options. Emergency options over Europe included crash landing in Allied territory, crash landing in enemy territory and becoming a prisoner, or crash landing in neutral territory and being interned. Emergency options over the ocean included ditching near friendly forces and hoping for rescue, or ditching in open ocean and hoping the inflatable raft kept you alive until rescue arrived. Neither option was attractive. Pilots avoided fuel emergencies through obsessive planning and monitoring. The Pacific Theater presented different but equally severe fuel challenges. Distances over the Pacific Ocean were enormous. Island bases were separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of open water. No forced landing options existed. If you ran out of fuel over the Pacific, you ditched in the ocean. Rescue was possible if you ditched near friendly forces. If you ditched far from help, you face days or weeks in a raft hoping for rescue or death from exposure. The most famous long-range mission in the Pacific was Operation Vengeance, the mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese messages revealing that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18, 1943. The opportunity to eliminate Japan's most capable naval strategist was extraordinary. The tactical problem was equally extraordinary. The only Allied base within range of Bougainville was Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The distance from Henderson Field to Bougainville was approximately 435 miles one way. Round-trip distance was 870 miles. P-38 Lightnings had sufficient range to make the flight, but the mission would push aircraft to their limits. Any deviation from planned route or any combat that burned extra fuel could result in aircraft running out of fuel over the ocean. 16 P-38s were selected for the mission. 18 pilots were briefed. 2 aircraft developed problems before takeoff and aborted. The remaining 16 launched at 07:10 on April 18. They flew at altitudes between 10 and 50 feet above the ocean to avoid Japanese radar. Low-altitude flying increased fuel consumption because engines operated less efficiently in denser air. The pilots maintained strict radio silence and precise navigation. The flight to Bougainville took approximately 2.5 hours. The P-38s arrived exactly on schedule. They spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers escorted by 6 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. The Americans attacked. Captain Thomas Lanfear engaged one Betty and shot it down. Lieutenant Rex Barber attacked the second Betty. Both bombers crashed. Yamamoto was dead. The Americans turned for home. They had just fought a brief but intense aerial battle that burned fuel at high consumption rates. They faced a 435-mile flight over open ocean with diminishing fuel. One P-38, piloted by Lieutenant Raymond Hine, had been shot down by Zeros. The remaining pilots flew back to Henderson Field with fuel gauges showing steadily decreasing amounts. All surviving aircraft made it home. Post-flight inspections showed some had landed with minimal fuel remaining. The mission had succeeded, but the fuel margins were razor-thin. If weather had been worse, if navigation had been slightly off, if combat had lasted longer, some or all of the aircraft might have run out of fuel short of Henderson Field. The pilots understood this. They had flown a mission at the absolute edge of aircraft endurance because the target justified the risk. Operation Vengeance demonstrated what long-range fighters could accomplish. It also demonstrated the limitations. 435-mile radius was near maximum for P-38s operating under combat conditions. Longer missions required either better aircraft or mid-flight refueling. Mid-flight refueling for fighters did not exist in World War II. The solution was better aircraft. The North American P-51 Mustang transformed the strategic bombing campaign. The P-51, equipped with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard, combined long range with excellent high-altitude performance. With internal fuel and 2 external tanks, a P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip exceeding 1,000 miles. The P-51 arrived in large numbers in early to mid-1944. P-51 pilots faced the same fuel management challenges as P-38 pilots, but with better margins. The Packard Merlin engine was more fuel efficient than the Allison engines in the P-38. The P-51's single engine consumed less total fuel than the P-38's 2 engines. The airframe had lower drag. These factors combined to give the P-51 significantly longer range despite carrying similar fuel quantities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By summer 1944, P-51s equipped most 8th Air Force fighter groups. P-38s continued serving in the Mediterranean and Pacific where their twin-engine reliability was valued. P-47s continued serving in roles that required their ruggedness. But the P-51 became the primary long-range escort fighter over Germany. Bomber losses dropped dramatically. German fighter losses increased. The Luftwaffe could no longer prevent American bombers from striking any target in Germany. The transformation was statistical and dramatic. In October 1943, bomber losses on unescorted deep penetration missions exceeded 20%. By summer 1944, losses on escorted missions averaged under 3%. The difference was fighter escort all the way to targets and back. Fuel capacity had been the limiting factor. Once fighters had sufficient range, bomber survivability improved dramatically. Individual pilots still faced fuel emergencies. Combat was unpredictable. Plans changed. Enemies did not cooperate. Weather varied. Aircraft developed mechanical problems that increased fuel consumption. Ground crews occasionally made errors fueling aircraft. Any of these factors could create situations where pilots had to make difficult decisions about whether they could reach home. The decision tree for a pilot low on fuel had branches that all involved risk. Continue toward base and hope to make it, risking running out of fuel short of the runway. Divert to a closer friendly airfield, if one existed within range. Bail out over friendly territory if altitude permitted. Crash land in a field if altitude was too low for safe bailout. Ditch in water if over ocean and hope for rescue. Each option had consequences. None guaranteed survival. Pilots who found themselves critically low on fuel sometimes made it home through extraordinary flying skill and luck. They would shut down one engine if flying a twin-engine aircraft, reducing fuel consumption by half while using the remaining engine to maintain flight. They would reduce altitude to denser air where engines operated more efficiently. They would ret-rim the aircraft for maximum fuel efficiency. They would calculate fuel remaining against distance to base obsessively. The experience of flying on fumes was terrifying. Fuel gauges showing 0 did not mean tanks were completely empty. Small amounts of fuel remained in lines, in sumps, in the system itself. How much? It varied by aircraft and conditions. Maybe enough for 5 minutes. Maybe enough for 15. Pilots did not know. They flew watching for the engine to quit. When flying a multi-engine aircraft, one engine might quit before the other as fuel became uneven between tanks. Engine failure from fuel starvation is not dramatic. The engine does not explode or catch fire. It simply stops producing power. The propeller windmills. The aircraft begins descending. In a single-engine aircraft, you now have a glider with poor gliding characteristics. In a twin-engine aircraft, one engine might keep you airborne, but barely. Distance to base determined whether you survived or crashed. The psychological component was profound. Combat created stress from enemy action. Fuel emergencies created stress from your own situation. You were not being shot at. You were not maneuvering against enemies. You were simply watching fuel gauges and calculating whether you would make it. The helplessness intensified stress. Nothing you could do would create more fuel. You could only fly as efficiently as possible and hope it was enough. Ground crews understood this stress. When aircraft returned from long missions, ground crews watched for stragglers limping home. They watched for flares indicating emergencies. They listened for radio calls from pilots declaring fuel emergencies. When an aircraft landed after a fuel emergency, ground crews immediately checked remaining fuel. Sometimes they measured fuel in gallons. Sometimes they measured it in quarts. Sometimes they found almost nothing. Records from World War II document numerous instances of aircraft landing with minimal fuel. Some landed with 5 gallons remaining. Some landed with 2 gallons. Some landed with fuel gauges reading empty and engines dying as the aircraft touched down. These were not normal operations. These were emergencies that pilots survived through skill, preparation, and luck. The larger story is how fuel limitations shaped strategic options throughout the war. In early war, short-range fighters limited bombing missions to targets near fighter bases. As fighters gained range through better designs and external tanks, bombers could strike deeper into enemy territory. When fighters finally had range to escort bombers anywhere, the strategic bombing campaign achieved its objectives. Germany's industrial capacity was crippled. Oil production was destroyed. Transportation networks were paralyzed. Fighter range made this possible. The same pattern played out in the Pacific. Short-range fighters limited operations to islands within fighter radius of bases. Long-range fighters like the P-38 extended operational reach but remained limited. B-29 Superfortress bombers could strike Japan from the Mariana Islands, but fighters could not escort them. B-29s flew unescorted and suffered losses to Japanese fighters. The solution was capturing Iwo Jima, which put fighter bases within range of Japan. P-51s based on Iwo Jima could escort B-29s to Tokyo. Losses dropped. Mission effectiveness increased. Fuel determined what was possible. No amount of pilot courage or tactical brilliance could overcome fuel limitations. Aircraft could only fly as far as fuel allowed. This truth constrained operations throughout the war. The sides that solved fuel problems through better aircraft design, better logistics, and better operational planning gained decisive advantages. The experience of individual pilots pushed to fuel limits represents the human dimension of these strategic realities. Joe Moser flying on Fumes to escort a damaged B-17 made a moral choice. He sacrificed his own fuel margin to save another crew. The Operation Vengeance pilots flew a mission at the edge of endurance because the target was worth the risk. Thousands of pilots on long-range bomber escort missions monitored fuel obsessively and landed with reserves measured in minutes rather than hours. These experiences were common enough that pilots developed gallows humor about fuel. They joked about flying on fumes and prayers. They joked about fuel gauges that read empty having mysterious additional fuel that appeared when needed. They joked about engines running on fresh air after tanks ran dry. The humor masked genuine fear. Every pilot who flew long missions understood that fuel exhaustion meant death unless you were very lucky. The technological solutions that extended range came from incremental improvements compounded over time. Better engines with improved fuel efficiency. Better aerodynamics that reduced drag. Better external tanks that carried more fuel with less drag penalty. Better fuel with higher octane that allowed engines to produce more power from less fuel. Better planning that optimized routes and power settings. Each improvement added small amounts of range. Combined, the improvements transformed capabilities. The P-51 Mustang epitomized these improvements. This Packard Merlin engine was more efficient than earlier engines. This laminar flow wing reduced drag. Its fuel system allowed pilot to use external tanks efficiently. This weight was optimized. The result was an aircraft that could fly farther on the same amount of fuel than any previous fighter. This extended range decided the air war over Germany. But even the P-51 had limits. Pilots still monitored fuel. Missions still required careful planning. Emergencies still occurred. The improved range meant missions that previously were impossible became routine. But routine missions still required pilots to manage fuel properly. The margin between success and running out of fuel was larger than with earlier aircraft, but the margin still existed. The stories of pilots landing with 5 gallons remaining, or 2 gallons or fumes, represent extremes. Most missions did not push fuel to these limits. Most pilots landed with adequate reserves. But the extremes illustrate what was possible when necessity demanded. When the mission required maximum effort, when saving another crew was worth the risk, when eliminating a critical target justified pushing limits, pilots flew missions that consumed every available gallon. These missions succeeded because of meticulous preparation, accurate navigation, proper engine management, and sometimes luck. They failed when any variable went wrong. Weather changes that increased headwinds. Navigation errors that added distance. Combat that burned extra fuel. Mechanical problems that increased consumption. Any of these could transform a successful mission into a fuel emergency. The lesson is not that pilots should push fuel limits. The lesson is that when strategic necessity demands maximum effort, properly designed aircraft operated by well-trained pilots can accomplish missions at the edge of technical capability. The 11-hour mission, the 2,000-mile mission, the landing with 5 gallons remaining, these represent what was possible when everything went right. They also represent what was lost when things went wrong. Pilots who ran out of fuel and could not reach base. Pilots who ditched in the ocean and drowned. Pilots who crashed attempting emergency landings. These losses were costs of pushing range limits. Strategic necessity sometimes demanded accepting these costs. Lives were spent to accomplish missions that altered the course of the war. The balance between risk and necessity defined long-range operations. Commanders weighed mission importance against fuel margins. Pilots weighed orders against their assessment of what was possible. Ground crews prepared aircraft knowing that pilots would push them to limits. The system worked because everyone understood both the capabilities and the limitations. Joe Moser landed at Warmwell with ounces of fuel remaining. He had pushed his P-38 past theoretical limits to save a B-17 crew. 50 years later, he discovered the crew had survived. The mission was worth the risk. That determination, that some missions justify maximum effort regardless of risk, characterized the pilots who flew at range limits throughout World War II. The mathematics of fuel consumption remain unforgiving. An aircraft can only fly as far as fuel allows. But within those mathematical limits, human determination and skill can accomplish extraordinary things. The long-range missions of World War II proved that when strategic necessity demanded, pilots and aircraft could reach targets that seemed impossible and return with fuel measured in gallons rather than empty tanks. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.